There's a moment many founders reach without realizing it. The moment where the product stops being something they're shaping and starts shaping them.
Most founders don't fail because of bad ideas. They fail because the build takes over, and before they realize it, they've lost control of their product, their budget, and their timeline.
Welcome to the DesignRush Podcast. I'm your host, Kia Johnson. Today, I'm joined by Keith Shields, CEO of Designli. Keith works closely with non-technical founders who are trying to turn ideas into real products without losing clarity, control, or direction along the way. This is a conversation about ownership, about decisions, and about what changes when that responsibility starts to drift. We talk about the earlier signs something is going off course, why development is really a sequence of decisions, how to define success before any code is written, and why early validation can save months of time and effort. If you're building SaaS products, working with an agency, or leading a product without a technical background, this episode will give you a clearer way to think about the process. Make sure you subscribe and let's get into it. Keith, you have worked with a lot of founders who started with big ideas and then somehow ended up in full-blown build chaos. Now, when you look back, what is usually the very first red flag where you think, okay, this is about to go off the rails and get messy?
The first red flag is when a founder can't clearly explain what winning actually looks like, not just a list of features, but also the outcome they're trying to create for their users or their business. So if that clarity isn't there and the goals of the software prove hard to document, which happens more than you might think if the customer keeps going in circles about different ideas or grand plans for the future or what ifs and is unable to kind of narrow down what a first version would need to actually accomplish, then the project is going to be at risk if it enters the development phase without ensuring that that's nailed down. Because software doesn't tolerate fuzzy thinking, right? So when the goal isn't clear from the start, confusion and rework show up pretty quickly. So our process at Designli actually begins with this 2-week discovery phase that we call the solution lab, where the goal is in center of focus mapped out. Each feature is thought through the lens of what is the leanest possible implementation of that feature that can be included in a first version. And then it's designed in a clickable simulation. So when you do all that stuff, you kind of have agile development with guardrails. We can tie back future conversations and brainstorming sessions to that already signed off kind of vision for what the first launch point is and keep things on track.
I'm sure you've come across this quite a bit. A lot of non-technical founders actually think that hiring a dev team is now the hard part and that everything else just falls into place. So what do you then think is the most dangerous misconception behind that type of mindset? And then how quickly does it actually start to cause problems?
Yeah, I agree. The biggest misconception is thinking development is execution instead of decision-making. So especially non-technical founders, they kind of assume that once they hire smart developers, the right product will magically emerge if they tell those folks what features to build. So in reality, when you're building a new product, every line of code is a bet, especially when you're going from what we call vision to version 1, building new stuff. So without strong product leadership, teams will build something, but not necessarily the right thing. So someone on the development team needs to be responsible for understanding the client's desired outcome, what the feature is going to accomplish, and then unpacking the possible ways code can be written to make the smallest possible working increment of that feature, like I said before, and then manage the client's expectations with getting that out in the world for real user testing and feedback before you go deeper on building more complexity into that piece of functionality. And you asked how long that takes to blow up. It actually takes quite a while to blow up on the customer, maybe 6 to 8 months. And the founder realizes that they built a really robust feature that does X thing, but that they've never gotten outside opinions on it. And so then it's launched, but then needs to change significantly. And they now realize that many of the past months were wasted on stuff that now needs to be thrown out.
So you're talking about some of these things that obviously, you never really want to be in that space in the first place. So I'd love for you to actually take us through a real example where a founder's build went completely sideways. And I'd like you to look at things like, or speak about, talk to the kind of things that actually broke and then, what did it cost them in time or money? And how did you then help them regain control of the product?
There's a million examples of how we've inherited bad stuff after something went sideways. I think a classic theme, if we're talking themes, is that for a non-technical founder, oftentimes a feature feels close to completion, where the founder says, oh, I just need a few small bugs fixed before this feature's ready to go. Or my development agency can't seem to complete this. The last 10% is taking months and months to complete. So regardless of what their engagement model is with that current development team, whether they're on a fixed fee model or a paying hourly for time or paying a flat monthly fee for a dedicated team, they kind of lose trust with that agency since they're losing time or money or both and seeing no meaningful progress. So the key for that type of scenario that we focus on is to understand the root cause of why the feature is unable to be completed, and importantly, pump the brakes on their expense while a plan is being formulated. It could be a bunch of stuff like poorly structured code, crumbling dependencies because software relies on a lot of third-party integrations, whatever it might be. So we kind of help them with a no-cost code audit that we call the impact week, where we analyze the code base through the lens of what the most critical problems are and come up with a turnaround game plan. And they can take that plan back to their current agency to try to have them approach the problem with fresh eyes, or of course we can staff a development team to take over, whichever they'd prefer. But that's a pretty common theme, is, oh, I just need 2 bugs fixed, I'll finally be ready to go, right? And you get stuck in that kind of last 5-10%.
On top of what you just mentioned to me, because this sounds a little bit like a nightmarish experience, but I'm sure that every founder's nightmare is also that of the black box experience, where the agency then disappears and then resurfaces like months later with something that's half-baked. So how do you then design a process where that simply cannot happen?
It's funny you asked. That the reason my business partner Josh and I actually built Designli in the first place is precisely for that reason. We experienced the black box effect as paying customers ourselves with our first startup when we were college students. So the abridged version is we raised an investment round. We were paying about a dozen agencies to build different apps for us. And almost every single one of those experiences was horrible. We got 0 communication, 0 updates. And then 6 months later, oh, here's a buggy app. And it's not to our vision. And so at Designli, we tell that story, that founding story, or our personal experience anyway, to every single new employee that we bring on board. So each of our 94 current employees knows that founding story intimately and is on a group mission to make the software development experience an enjoyable one. We say we want to make it a 5-star experience, eliminating that black box effect that software so often comes with, especially for non-technical founders that don't know the lingo, don't know what the process should typically entail. And so tactically, to answer your question, we keep that from happening with just the way we're super intentional on how we keep customers in the loop every step of the way. We know the clients are non-technicals. We've designed our process around that. So you've got regular demos, shared decision logs, transparent and regular updates, and kind of treating that founder like a product partner, not a client waiting for a perfect delivery, because that's how you get into that. It's like, oh, we can't share anything until it's exactly perfect. 6 months goes by and, okay, there was some misalignment.
I've actually heard a little bit about your founding story, but I have also heard that in terms of those founding stories, that you actually started with nothing. I'd love for you to share that with us before I actually move to the next question. Can you tell us a little bit more?
As college students, like most college students have nothing, right? So we were we were mechanical engineering students. We in college, and we were starting to get kind of urged into doing internships kind of after sophomore year. And so my business partner and I were buddies. And we kind of learned through that process that when you decide to become a mechanical engineer because you want to design airplanes, but once you're doing internships, you realize that really you're just focused on a single bolt in like the wheel, and you're doing that for 6 months. So it's really less exciting than designing an airplane. And so that's also right when Instagram sold to Facebook for $1 billion and had no revenue, right? And just a bunch of users. So we got inspired to enter the software landscape, and I had done some coding work, and so had my business partner in the past, but nothing too major. And we didn't have any kind of idea for what the next big consumer-facing app could be, but we figured end users might, right? So the idea was to launch this business called Applets, where folks could come on, submit a little napkin sketch of what they wish their phone could do in an app, vote on their favorites. We, the business, would say, hey, we'll build the highest voted idea at the end of each month and split the profits with everyone that helped. So if it was your concept, you get, percentage of future revenues. And so that concept kind of was aligned with other startups in different spaces. Like there was Quirky doing that same idea for consumer products. And so we were able to raise an angel investment round for it. So we didn't start with total nothing, right? We had a decent kind of funding round, nothing major. But anyway, that was a very eye-opening experience because we successfully built this voting community of, I think we had 16,000 users coming on and submitting app ideas and voting on their favorites. But the build, because one winning app idea each month is way too much for two guys to code themselves, right? So we were paying agencies to build the winning ideas. And that was a very eye-opening experience, because you'd think that if you had some funding and agency that you could build software without fail over and over again repeatedly. But man, that black box effect really just was an eye-opening experience, and that inspired us to build an agency.
Before anyone actually writes a single line of code, what is the hardest truth that founders usually don't want to hear, but you feel actually they absolutely need to understand if they want to build software the right way?
Yeah, good question. I think our number one job as an agency when helping non-technical folks start the journey of building software is to convince the customer that their feature ideas aren't flawless, untouchable, and perfect. Folks need to be willing to negotiate or compromise around what their version 1 includes and get something that may not be their perfect dream end goal to market as soon as possible, which helps make sure we're building the right stuff, right? And I like to tell folks all the time, I'm not a startup expert. If I was, I'd be running Facebook, not Designli. So I don't think anyone can call themselves a startup expert. So we need to rely on feedback instead of just our own intuition. And most non-technical folks don't approach the conversation this way, and that's not their fault. Like, people like you and I were used to buying a car with a set number of known features that cost exactly X dollars, but that's fundamentally different from software, which is malleable and not fixed. So our job as the agency is to help show them that there's other ways we can help reduce their risk as a startup founder, like launching early and often and being flexible on what their MVP implementation of each individual feature might look like. So that's the mindset.
So, Keith, a lot of teams actually equate progress with adding more features. But from your experience, when does that mindset flip, actually start slowing down everything instead of like speeding it up?
Totally. Yeah. Adding more features slows things down once those features stop serving the single core job. And like what I mean by that is every digital product out there has a core spine of what it's supposed to help the user accomplish. So once features start pulling in different directions and it pretty quickly you feel velocity drop because teams are context switching and users have a big sidebar menu and are starting to get confused. So that complexity compounds quietly over time, but then all of a sudden everything feels slow because tech debt caused from unused features drags down the whole system. So a lot of people add features, but very rarely does the product manager stop and say, what features are not used? Let's trim.
Everyone talks about speed, Keith, but focus is obviously the harder part. If you're looking at the real sort of day-to-day product work, for yourself personally, what does clarity and focus actually look like when a team is building?
Clarity and focus look kind of boring from the outside. It's fewer meetings, fewer priorities, shorter to-do lists. We have tasks that directly tie to the user problem and the measurable outcome that is proving if it's worth doing. And if something's not moving the product closer to validation or revenue or like the main mission, then it doesn't get built. So that it's exactly that feeling, and we call it the calm, confident feeling that Designli tries to help non-technical founders get to. Because leading a software as a service business doesn't have to be crazy stressful.
Feedback itself can actually completely change the course of a product. So was there like a moment where fast, early feedback actually forced a project to pivot in a way that ultimately made it better?
A good theme or a good thing we see a lot is when quick feedback makes you realize that you should not do something, which is kind of counterintuitive. So we've had founders a lot of times, talking about kind of people's mentality when they come into the process. A lot of founders are convinced that a feature was the differentiator. It's an absolute must. And so we've encouraged those founders to see if that's true. Let's get some feedback early on. Let's create a prototype that can be tested, put in front of real users. And then we all realize as a group pretty quickly that users don't care at all. So when you do that testing early, that insight can cost, days instead of months of development work and a bunch of money and development time they didn't necessarily need to do in the first place.
If you were to look at, brands and agencies itself, obviously, brands and agencies, they want to stay creative without losing the consistency. So how do you then actually build a process that keeps both the structure and then also that freedom at the same time? I mean, it is all about that creative freedom, right? Especially when you sort of like, dive into that kind of space. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another good question. What's great about structure is that structure defines the boundaries and then freedom lives within those boundaries, right? You hear that answer to questions like that a lot. So if you have clear stages and clear ownership and clear decision makers within that, teams are free to explore solutions creatively. And without that structure, creativity is, especially in software, can turn into noise and future brainstorming that's super distracting and kind of pulls the team every which way. So that a year goes by and you look back and you're unsure what you accomplished. So we're always trying to get customers to have a clear roadmap of priorities that we can at least stick to for a little while.
Now, something I'm sure you feel, well, I don't know if you personally feel this, but when one thinks of like tech debt, it actually sounds very much like an internal problem. But what's interesting is that users actually do feel this almost immediately. So then how do you, as Keith and Designli, then spot and address those issues early before they start hurting the user experience? I'm sure that's quite a space for you to be in, it's like a learned experience over time, I guess. So yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
We treat quality as a product feature, not as an engineering only concern. So if something feels fragile to developers internally, it will feel slow externally to users, whether that's now or sometime in the future. So I think the core thing is to surface trade-offs to the customer in real time and discuss them with the founder of the product so that the founder can consciously choose what to defer instead of accidentally accumulating tech debt. And we encourage them to build that into the development plan and the tickets that the devs are prioritizing in the next sprints, that it doesn't just quietly compound until later. But yes, users do absolutely feel it. So yeah, good point.
If you were to look at just the sort of the grander scheme of things, there's so much data out there right now. But even with all that data out there, so many founders do actually still skip demand validation and then they jump straight into building. Why do you think that specific mistake keeps happening time and time again?
Probably because building feels productive when your head's down, coding stuff or having folks code for you and building a bunch of features. But validation, on the other hand, feels uncomfortable, right? Talking to users or potential users risks hearing something you don't want to hear. And on the other side, churning out a bunch of code and features feels like a super productive thing to do. But obviously the market doesn't care how much effort you put in.
So this actually brings me to my next question. If a founder is then absolutely convinced that the idea is great, but they haven't really tested it yet, what is the conversation that you usually have with them at that stage?
Yeah, I'd tell them that confidence is different than having evidence. So if the idea is strong, validation will only make it stronger. So there's no reason not to do it. And if it's weak, and learning that early is kind of a gift rather than a failure. So that's the mentality to try to encourage people to have.
I want to take us a little bit more to, current news and things that's happening, in the industries itself. And I'm sure that you come across this all the time. And obviously being in the space that you're in, you need to make sure that you're always, on top of the information, making sure that you realize and understand what is currently happening within the markets. So when you hear that something like 95% of AI pilots fail, does that actually surprise you at all based on what you've seen in startup and product builds?
AI kind of magnifies existing problems. So if your product strategy is fuzzy, AI just helps you fail faster. And most pilots fail because they start with tools instead of hypotheses. So we're all about hypothesis-driven development. We've had some blog posts on DesignRush about that topic. But pilots need measurable business goals that can be clearly measured against as success or failure, right?
So speaking about, hypotheses-driven development, how does that actually then help founders to stay focused and avoid becoming part of that overwhelming failure percentage, would you say?
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about it a little bit more. It's not something we invented, but it's also not very well talked about in the world of software development services, especially focused on folks that are coming from a non-technical lens. And so, yeah, we're all about hypothesis-driven development. What's awesome about hypothesis-driven development is that it forces discipline. You're not building a feature because it's exciting, or, in your previous question, you're not implementing an AI pilot because it's exciting. You're testing a specific belief about user behavior or efficiency or something you're able to measure. And then if the hypothesis fails, you stop. And so that restraint is what keeps teams from investing too much in an exciting new trend or idea, especially now with, all the hype. You may fail, but at least it's fast and you had minimal exposure to that bet. And again, that's not anything. It doesn't sound too groundbreaking because it's the scientific method that you and I learned in high school, right? Just applied to software dreams, software tests.
When you look at a story like Flip, for example, what does it actually reveal about the risks of then scaling fast before you've truly validated what works?
It's kind of a reminder that growth and momentum without discipline is dangerous. And so when you're growing fast like Flip did, growth amplifies flaws. So if that foundation isn't solid, then scaling just makes the collapse bigger and much more public.
And you obviously don't want to be in that space in the first place. Definitely, yeah. Now, if we wanted to look at momentum, so momentum itself, it can be very addictive for founders. So how do you then help them slow down enough to actually build something that is more sustainable instead of just chasing, those growth signals all the time?
It's funny. We talk about this a lot internally. Ultimately, Designli is a services business that serves up what customers ask for, right? Like any services company. But you are right that we can absolutely do our best to educate customers who have never done this before on what the smartest path is to reach their goals. And we certainly hope our clients consider that advice, but they're not obligated to. So we always try to anchor decisions back to the user and the business model. And vanity metrics are easy to get excited about. They're loud and they're distracting, but those fundamentals are quiet, right? We want founders to listen to those quiet fundamental signals.
If you could sit down with every non-technical founder right before they hire their first developer, what is then the one lesson you'd want them to understand? And why does that matter more than anything else?
The one thing would be that building software is a leadership responsibility, not something you delegate away. So you don't need to write code, but you do need to own the product decisions and have a framework of thinking through them and prioritizing them and not getting carried away with your own brain. And that lesson matters because the moment a founder abdicates that role, they lose the grasp of what their team is doing and why. Especially in the early days, staying really close to the product and the users is number one priority.
Keith, I have to say that I have absolutely enjoyed every piece of our conversation here today. It's been insightful, it's been interesting, and I can actually see why it is you do what you do. Thank you so much for coming on the DesignRush podcast. Really do appreciate your time. It's been absolutely insightful, and best of luck with all the future endeavors with Designli. I'm looking forward to seeing much more of you guys out there.
Thank you, Kia. Great chatting.
Curious about what top brands look for when choosing an agency? Tune into our latest episodes where we reveal the decision-making secrets of leading brands. Subscribe to the DesignRush podcast and stay ahead of the competition.